Good evening, everybody. On behalf of River Falls Public Library, I'm Anita Slade, a library assistant here, probably for the last 9 years. Tonight we have John Armbruster, who I first heard about after I read an article about him talking at with some veterans at my hometown of Augusta on the other side of Eau Claire. And then John, our cataloger, had already bought a couple books of his, Tailspin. So I looked more into it, and he was able to graciously come up tonight. He earned a journalism degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and began his career writing environmental science stories for Earthwatch Radio, part of the SKI grant at the University of Wisconsin. He later wrote for the La Crosse Tribune, covering general assignment news, and later the Marshfield News Herald, writing sports stories. He returned to UW-Madison and earned his secondary education degree in social studies. He later completed a Master's of Education degree at Viterbo University in La Crosse. Since '93, he has taught a variety of history and government courses to middle and high school students, including AP courses in American and European history. John lives on a small farm in the heart of the Driftless region in southwest Wisconsin. He has 2 sons, Matthew and Joe. Sadly, his wife Carmen died in 2012. That's also part of his story. Last, a big thank you to our American Legion and Women's Auxiliary for helping hosting this event. So welcome, John Armbruster.
Thank you, Kim. Just a little bit of housekeeping to let you know how this goes. It's about a 50-minute program. And then, Kim, I didn't ask you, did you want me to do a little Q&A afterward?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, Anita. Oh, sorry, Anita. Anita. Okay. Did you want me to do a little Q&A afterward then?
If you would like.
Yeah, that'd be fine. And then I'll take some of your questions. And then if I don't get to your questions, I'll be glad to talk to you at the table where all the books are and where I will be selling and signing books or signing books that you've already purchased. And I'll take more questions right there too. Anita, you have me as long as you want. And I'll try and keep it to about an hour. I grew up in a small town Catholic church, so I know what happens when the priest goes beyond an hour. People start giving me dirty looks. So I will try to keep it to an hour. All right. This is I was just telling someone, this is I think my 130th presentation for this book. So I'm going to count again when I get home, somewhere around there. So, and what's really great about it is that I have been all over the state of Wisconsin, the Midwest. This is the first time I've been in River Falls after being a lifelong Wisconsin resident. So I know it sounds strange, but first time I've been in River Falls. So thank you very much, and hopefully get a chance to see it a little bit tonight as I leave. But we are not here to talk about me. We are here to talk about this man right here, Eugene Moran. This is the man that fell 4 miles without a parachute in World War II and lived. A legendary story in Wisconsin for a long time, although he did not talk about it until 2011. So Gene and I worked on the book for about 3 years, just about a little more than 3 years before he died in 2014. And then it took me another 8 years to complete the book. And let's see, that was in 2014. Yes, another 8 years to complete it. And the book came out 3 years ago this April. We launched it in La Crosse. I first heard this story when I got my first full-time teaching job in Crawford County. So I was going to do this. My first time in River Falls. What county am I in? Pierce? Right there? Sorry, right there? Do I have it? Yes, and I also taught geography for 30 years. So sorry about that. On the way here, I'm like, just before the speech, I'm like, I forgot to check what county River Falls is in. So anyway, all right. So I would say it's about, Gene grew up about 3 miles south here in the Driftless area. This is Crawford County, and Soldiers Grove is in North Crawford County. I first heard this story more than 30 years ago. It was my first full-time teaching job. And if you look carefully there, that is the school where I taught for 20 years before I moved to another district. That building right there is an auditorium. And it was an in-service day, and I just moved to the area. I didn't know anyone. And I was kind of shy, hanging by myself. And during a break in presentations, there were 2 teachers from a visiting district talking in front of me in this conversation about a guy that fell 4 miles without a parachute and lived. So I leaned forward in my chair and eavesdropped in their conversation. Found out that the guy lived just up the road and that he had a daughter that taught at that school. Well, that daughter, Joni, she was an art teacher and her classroom was right next to mine. So at the end of the day, I burst into this room. I'm in, my mid-20s and I'm this geeked out World War II guy here. And I'm like, oh my God, is this true? The story I heard today. And she was setting out supplies for the next arts day. And she said, yes, old lean Jean, the fighting machine. And I just bombed her with, no pun intended, but with all kinds of questions. And I said, well, we have to have your dad come to school and we're going to have a big Jean Moran day. We're going to do speeches and poster project. I get this all planned out. And remember, she dropped a ream of construction paper on her art table and glared at me. And she said this, we don't go there. And that's not happening. And I was very embarrassed and kind of shrunk into silence. I should have known better than to be so enthusiastic. Joni herself, she had just lost her husband a couple of months before I arrived at North Crawford. He was a Vietnam veteran who was shot in the back and paralyzed. And he had died of a heart attack just a few months before I showed up in North Crawford. So she's dealing with her own veteran issues. And I learned that her dad didn't speak about this story for 60 some years. Now, a few days later, Joni came into my classroom. I think she felt a little bit badly about being brusque with me. And she laid this newspaper on my desk and said, well, if you find out anything more, here you go, read this. You find out anything more, you'll know more than my brothers and sisters. This is all I have. And what it is, a La Crosse Tribune newspaper article from 1992. And if you can see the airplane there, that is the type of airplane that Jean flew. He was a tail gunner on in World War II, a B-17 Flying Fortress. Every Father's Day, La Crosse has an air show at the airport, and Jean went up he heard that his old plane was going to be there, and he went up with a friend, and, no fanfare, didn't tell anybody. But a reporter from the La Crosse Tribune had caught wind of the man that fell 4 miles without a parachute and lived. And if you guys look carefully here, does Jean look happy about having to do this? Not at all. When Jean and I finally got working on the story years later, I showed him that article. I'm like, what's going on here? And he kind of said, yeah, I told the reporter, you get one picture, 3 questions. So that is the article right there. There's no other parts of this article. It was on the front page that day, but there's very little information here. So the story was still hidden. Now, Jean was famous before. These are articles from 1944. The story of his famous fall had leaked back into the United States through the Associated Press. And these articles were sent to his mother, and there were many more, but sent to him from areas all over the country. I know the one on the left was from New York. You can see St. Paul right there. And this one was from Baltimore. And when Jean came home in 1945, he got off the troop train at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. I had a cousin pick him up and take him to Milwaukee. And a Wisconsin State Journal reporter tracked him down. And Jean started figuring out that he might be well known at the end of the war. He wasn't happy about that, but he did do a few questions for that Wisconsin State Journal reporter, and then he shut down for 60 plus years. There's nothing else. There's no articles, no television shows and books, nothing. Now that's going to change in 2007. So one of the reasons we're here tonight is to talk about the genesis of the story. That was never supposed to happen. This started in 2007. Now, does anybody recognize this man right here, Congressman Ron Kind? Is the 3rd district come all the way up to River Falls? It does. Okay, so we are in the 3rd congressional district right now. Wasn't sure where the border was. So for those of you who don't know, Ron Kind was our longtime congressman here for the 3rd district, and he did something called the Veterans Oral History Project. Went around the 3rd district in western Wisconsin and orally recorded stories from World War II, Korean, Vietnam veterans for the Library of Congress. It was a pet project of his. Ron, just out of the blue, called Jean one day, and shockingly, Jean agreed to it. And Jean's daughter, Joni, called me up, and breathlessly, she couldn't stop talking. And if you know anything about Jean, she is to conversation what water is to Niagara Falls. It's constant and voluminous. And I got her to quiet down, and she said, yes, you and the family are invited. You may come on up to the interview. And Ron was nice enough to come to my book launch party 3 years ago. He said, yes, I remember that interview. That one didn't go very well. And it did. I was there in a room very similar to this at the La Crosse airport. About 15 minutes, Jean all of a sudden just shut it down and said, we're done. And okay, it was abrupt. Now, Gene did go outside. There was a plane waiting for him. That is a Flying Fortress bomber from the Oshkosh Air Show run by the EAA. Ron kind of arranged for that to be there that day. It was kind of a Gene Moran day at the La Crosse Airport. And these are my two sons. They went running up to Gene to snap this picture before he got onto the door. Both my late wife and I, we lost our fathers early, so my sons did not have grandfathers. And as we got to know Gene over the years, Gene became kind of like a surrogate grandfather to my boys. He attended their birthday parties and bonfires, and like Gene, I'm also Catholic, so their first communions. And so they went up to snap a quick picture with Gene, and Gene got into that door right there. Now in the war, he served as a tail gunner, normally sitting back here, but he got to sit up front this time. They did a 20-minute ride over the Mississippi River Valley and landed the plane, and Gene came back out that door, and I watched from afar, but the reporters and TV cameras ran up to him, and Gene waved him off immediately. He said, nope, that's the last time I do this. And I don't think he was just talking about a plane ride. So I thought, well, we're done. This is as far as it goes. Now, in the years following that, I really started pestering Gene's kids. I'm like, you've got to get your dad to talk. This is an amazing story. He can't take this to the grave. When one of the daughters came up to me and said, well, Smarty Pants, why don't you write it? And I said, no. I find it a little bit ironic, and I say this every time I do a speech. I feel a little bit like a phony. I had no intention of becoming a writer. I've been to enough writers' conference now, and I see the zeal and the passion that these people have that they put into the books. I never wanted to do this. I said no to this project. Now, I do have some writing experience, as Anita mentioned at the beginning. I had first graduated with a degree in journalism from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I wrote for the La Crosse Tribune in my hometown newspaper for a little while, the Marshfield News Herald. Now, I have to admit, this is very misleading. Rarely as a cub reporter right out of college did I get a front page byline, or did I get my picture in the newspaper. I did a lot of small town stories. If a barn was on fire, I was going to be there. A lot of high school basketball games and even middle school stuff. It was small town news, which I liked. But I was no way qualified to write such an amazing World War II story. And not only that, this is my wife and my two sons. My wife is fighting cancer at that time. Now, when they asked me, the cancer was in remission. She was healthy at that point, but I have two young boys, a wife fighting cancer, a full-time teaching job and coaching. This was not something I wanted to do. About a year later, after I'd said no, it was an in-service, the beginning of the school year. Gene's daughter, Joni, came running up to me and said, guess what? We got Dad to agree to a book. I'm like, that's wonderful. Who's your author? Tell me about it. Author? You are. And I said, Joni, I already gave you my answer. I said, no. And a quote that I remember word for word, and she does too, is she looked at me and she said, John, Dad's not going to do it unless you do it. Now, this was August, in-service week at my school. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes. And it took me another 4 or 5 months to screw on my courage and say, okay, for the first time, we're going to talk about this. How do I broach this topic? How do I butter up Gene? And in Wisconsin, you take the guy out for his favorite fish fry to his favorite bar, all right? And you make sure his favorite beer is there. But now I'm going to, if you give me a moment, I'm going to read a very quick selection from my book about how that first meeting about talking about the war went. I drove straight from my school and parked in front of the tavern. I sat in my dark vehicle. The car thermometer registered a mere 10 degrees. The last shards of pink sky faded tonight. I hadn't eaten in hours, but I had no appetite. Of course, I'd shared meals with Gene before, but this time the stakes were so high. I gotta pause here for a second. That's the tornado drill. Are we to do anything? So it's not an air raid drill for the program that you have. Okay. I thought that would be really cool. Okay. Thank you. Okay. I hadn't eaten in hours, but I had no appetite. Of course, I'd shared meals with Gene before, but this time the stakes were so high. I stared at the red and white neon Budweiser sign in the tavern window and wrestled with my self-doubt. I'm not a writer. I spend 50 plus hours a week at my school. I have 2 growing sons. And the question that shadowed everything, as it had for 8 years, would my wife's cancer return? And if I didn't write Gene's story, who would? So I headed into the tavern. The place was full. Men nursing cans of Bud Light and Coors Light sat on bar stools that ringed the oval bar. Joni had already staked out a table in the rear of the dining room. Gene wore his usual bib overalls and Army Air Corps baseball cap. Jody kept the conversation light, but I said little. The waitress jotted down our orders for beer and soda. Gene asked for his usual can of Blatz. Pause here 1 second. I did 2 speeches in Boston a few weeks ago. I talked about fish fries and Blatz, and they looked at me clueless. I'm like, who are you people? Have you never been to Wisconsin? So, you guys know Blatz, right? Okay, thank you. The smell of fried cod and steaming baked potatoes arriving at our table helped settle my nerves a bit. It was time to talk about it. I looked at Gene and swallowed. Yeah, I was thinking about starting after Christmas on Thursdays after school for an hour or so. Will that work? I asked. Gene kept eating, not looking at me. That would be fine, John. But his eyes were riveted on his fish. Yeah, I'd like to get in as many interviews as we can before spring, and then I'm busy with coaching. But as soon as school is out in the summer, we can pick up with the interviews. Gene nodded, but didn't talk. Okay, I want to start talking mostly about you growing up on the farm. We can move to the war later. I hope talk of his childhood instead of the war would put Gene at ease. But I could sense Joni was getting restless. Dad, she burst out. There's so much you haven't told anybody, she rushed on. You need to talk about your prisoner of war days and that shipwreck. The shipwreck when the Germans transferred you. We know nothing about that. Gene stopped eating and slowly set his fork down. He set both his arms on the table, looked up, and sat back in his chair. They didn't like what was happening. Joni's mention of that ship had stirred something in Gene. I closed my eyes and said to myself, Jesus, Johnny, shut up. You're moving too fast. But he pressed on, firing questions, rapidly talking, oblivious to her father's change in mood. Then Gene turned toward his daughter and roared, there are some things that are never going into any book. Everyone at the table froze. Nearby diners stopped talking. I didn't know what to say or do. Just 5 minutes into this project, it was already blowing up in my face. Gene, I said at last, this is your story. We don't need to do this. Gene quietly picked up his can of Blatz and took a sip. He studied me for a moment, then his face softened. John, if we don't do it now, it will never happen. So we're going to do it. 1 month later, we begin, and this is where we begin. And I always tell everyone, this is my favorite slide of my presentation. This is Gene's home. Now, he did raise his family in a larger home in Soldiers Grove, but this is his retirement home. He is a simple man, and this is the way he wants to live. So for those of you who read Tailspin, for 3 years, Gene and I worked there. Tailspin comes from that home in a mobile home park in Soldiers Grove, as humble as it gets. I want to show you his resume, though, for such a humble man. I mean, he was a decorated World War II veteran. After the war, he started a trucking business with the GI Bill, but back then trucking was still a very physical job, and his war wounds did not allow him to do that job for many years. So he got a job with the post office, where he worked for 30 years. He was the hometown fire chief for 30 years, started the first ambulance crew in Crawford County, a very big deal in the 1950s. County board government for 20 years. American Legion for 68 years, and was the first ever recipient of the Wisconsin Veterans Lifetime Achievement Award, personally awarded to him by the governor. It's quite a resume for a man living in a mobile home. That's the way Gene wants it. He does not live in a mansion, but what an impressive life. Now, I'm going to start Gene's story here, at least the war story part of it. In October of 1943, Gene was sent to England with the famed 8th Air Force. I know that many of you are familiar with the 8th Air Force, but for those of you that haven't, it is the largest bomber force ever put together in human history. At a time when the Nazis dominated the continent, the Americans were trying to win the war at that point through the air with these massive bomber formations. But in 1943, it was not going very well. When Gene got there, 25 missions were required of each airman. 25, meaning you had to drop your bombs on your target, not just fly, 25 bombs on target. When Gene got there in 1943, only 1/3 finished their tour of duty. And actually, when I was in Boston a few weeks ago, there was a historian, he kind of just chipped in and said, in October of that year, only 20% were finishing their tour of duty. So Gene came in at a terrible time. When he first got there, he was in a shower at his air base, and one lucky guy that got 25 in looked at him and said, you know, for most of you guys, it's not if you go down, but when. So this is what Gene's coming into. This is Gene's airplane. If you look very carefully, you can barely see it there. It is called the Rikki Tikki Tavi. Now, the Rikki Tikki Tavi is a cartoon figure. It's based on a Rudyard Kipling novel of a mongoose in colonial India. It's the pet of a British boy. And it was actually Gene's nephew that helped me do some research and track down that picture. And I still don't know how he did it to this day, but he mailed it to me. He said, I think I found Uncle Gene's picture. Would you show it to him? I said, well, of course. Every Thursdays, Gene and I got together. And I remember when I came in with my research trophy and set it down on that kitchen table, I said, Gene, I think we found your plane. He grabbed his magnifying glass. Of course, he went right to the girl and said, oh, yeah, that's the Dolly. And I thought, what does a snake-eating mongoose have to do with the naked woman riding a bomb? And I thought, maybe we shouldn't even go there. But that is his plane. And this is Gene's crew. All of these bombers had 10-man crews. And Gene is right there standing far left. These are the 6 gunners that protect the plane. Gene at the time is 19, Andy's 19, Pee Wee just turned 20, Sweeto's 20, and the old man of this crew is Walter Reed, 23. By the way, Walter Reed, not the hospital Walter Reed, just a coincidence. Walter's actually a chicken farmer from Nebraska. I actually had the pleasure of speaking at his hometown last May. The pilot down here, 21 years old. Yeah, thank you for the Jesus. That just, why did this happen? Why were these guys young? The old man of the crew, Benny, the co-pilot, was 27. And this was not unusual. These crews were very, very young. The war happened so fast, so quickly, on such a scale. America threw its youngest at it. And I still don't understand the reasons why so many were so young. But what I'm saying, this was not atypical. This is a typical crew. They were very, very young. Most of them are under 25. On November 29th, 1943, this would be Gene's 5th mission over the city of Bremen, Germany. Bremen's about the size of Milwaukee, and like Milwaukee, it was an industrial city and was heavily defended. So this is Gene's 5th mission. Through a nasty fight, they did drop their bombs on target, so he got credit for his 5th mission. And then on the way home, well, I want you to remember this date, November 29th, 1943. I have a video, an animation that was made for my presentations that's going to show you what happened to Gene that afternoon. So, Kim, are we ready here? One of the questions I often get is, how do I know that he fell 4 miles? Well, I have Gene's mission records from that day. These were once classified, they're declassified now for historians and authors. And I have very detailed records of that day. They were assigned to fly at 28,000 feet, which is over 5 miles. Gene figured they lost about a mile of altitude in the air battle that you just witnessed there. So roughly 4 miles that he fell. One of the things he always wanted to set the record straight, though, he never lost consciousness, but he said he fell very, very quickly. It did not glide down, it fell. He said his teeth fillings popped out, blood rushed into his eyes from the rapid change in altitude and the G-forces. And when he hit the ground in a forest in northwestern Germany. And he said he crawled out and he started laughing. I'm like, laughing? He was like, I was so tickled, I had cheated death. At first he thought he was dead, crawled out the hole, crawled to the light, and it was actual sunlight from that cold November day. But he went up to his back and he felt no pain, but he had a strange sensation from his head, and he went up to feel it with his right arm, and he felt a gelatinous mass, which was his brain. His skull had split wide open. He had about an 8-inch skull fracture. So he knew he wasn't getting up and going anywhere. I have been to the exact spot where Gene fell. In 2018, actually it was 2017, a year before this, we got an invite from the city where Gene's plane blew up. If you remember in the video, the tail section became separated, the plane kept going forward, the flames caught up to the gasoline tanks in the wings, and boom, a massive explosion over the city of about 25,000. And it set fires all over that city, and it was quite a significant day in that city's history. So they invited Gene's family, other family members of the crew, and myself for a 4-day celebration, which they paid for everything. We were wined and dined, and we had a tour bus and a very formal city hall presentation. But they took us to the spot. These here are Gene's grandkids. There are more people on the other side of this photo here. And I'm actually right in here, if you can see a boom mic there, being interviewed by a German television crew. And I remember the question the reporter asked me, saying, all right, well, you're the author. Explain how he survived. And when I went to Germany, I was thinking, I don't know why, but I was thinking some Bavarian scene of sloping mountainsides with large pine trees that would cushion that blow. But it actually looks a lot like where I grew up in central Wisconsin, just flat, marshy woods, nothing to explain how he survived. I looked at the reporter and I said, I have no idea. At this point, I'm going to let Gene talk about his fall.
Were you still conscious?
Oh, yeah.
Were you stuck up there?
No. When it settled in, I caught it on the upswing.
I caught
the tree.
You caught the tree, yeah.
They said let in a tree. I didn't let in no tree. I let against the tree.
You laid against the tree?
Against the tree on the upswing of the...
Okay. When you were twisting and you're coming in.
Yeah, and this open part went down on the ground.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I crawled out the open part. Because then this open part dropped right down on the ground.
And then the open part kind of slid into the ground.
And I got turned around and crawled out. And by that time, the Frenchmen were there.
That fast?
Yeah. Oh, hell, they were watching the whole thing.
I'll pause for a second there. You may be confused. I said he fell in northwestern Germany. What are Frenchmen doing there? Gene went down nearby a POW camp, which had prisoners from nations all across Europe. And the Germans would let the French out for work details, or even sometimes to scrounge for food, because food is in short supply for everybody then. And under armed guard, But at this point, France is under Nazi occupation, so they weren't much of an escape risk. And what the French learned to do was to look for downed airplanes. Airplanes have all kinds of goodies on them that they can scavenge, and particularly American planes. American planes, many of their aircrew carried Hershey bars as part of their survival rations. So these guys were scavenging for food. They were the first to find Gene in that woods.
And how quickly between the time you crawled out and the Frenchmen were there?
Well, it could have been over 5 minutes.
5 minutes, because they'd been watching.
They'd been watching. They were just jabbering and going on, pointing at the sky, pointing at me, and pointing at the tail of the plane. I never knew why we slid back that day. I'll never know to this all. I'll never know.
Slid back.
We were right up in formation. Just girls in my chest. They were just shooting at us something terrible.
No, wait, the day you slid back, the day you got shot down?
Yeah. And we slid back, kept sliding back. And I even called and I said, what's the matter? We're not staying up in formation. We're being pushed out. Well, I don't know what he meant by being pushed out or what, whoever answered me, I can't remember. And boy, when we got pushed out.
Is that when the fighters all started hopping on you then? Yeah. When you guys started falling back, how many fighters were starting to hit you guys?
Well, I was shooting. Both waist gunners were shooting. The ball turret gunner was shooting. The top turret gun guy was shooting. And I believe the bombardier, he had a little gun poked out to one side. He was shooting too.
After Pee-wee hit and Orson's pushing the bombardier out, is the plane sustaining any damage at this time?
Oh, it's just getting right up.
Just
It wasn't the one that came up underneath. It was one that drifted in that came in. Oh, I could even see his scarf with his goggles.
you said you could see a scarf in his goggles.
Yeah, and he pointed down.
I'm going to pause you for 1 minute. One of the things I always hear, look at the audience when that part of the video comes up, and people are always kind of shocked, amazed, like, what? Yes, that is a German fighter plane that pulled it right up next to Gene. A brief pause in that battle. I don't know if he was some type of squadron leader, but there was a pause. So the Messerschmitt 109 airplane, he pulled up right next to Gene. Now, Gene hadn't told any of these stories for decades, not even to his own kids. They knew nothing. And my jaw had just hit the ground, and we're at his kitchen, right at his kitchen table. I'm like, how close was he to you? And he looks into the living room. He goes, from about me to the TV away. So just nonchalantly he told me that. And so they just stared at one another for a while.
He pointed down.
And you didn't know why he pointed down?
I figured he meant bail out.
Bail out. Okay.
That's what I figured he meant, but somebody cut loose up at front. Trapped, but you got to remember, I got a bone sticking out of this arm.
Oh, I don't know. When did that happen?
Oh, that happened through the mission. See, it started here and came off here, and I got bone sticking up through.
When did that happen in the mission?
On that mission.
But I mean, at what point?
Well, I don't know. I was too busy.
He had been shot in both forearms. And one of the bones, his right forearm, the bone snapped right through his leather jacket.
This one here was, oh hell, it was all bleeding out through the.
When did you get hit? I didn't know you'd been hit before that.
Oh God, I was hit 3 or 4 times. I had all these ribs broken. And then I started to crawl up to get, I had a chest chute laying right in front of the tail wheel. And I crawled up to get that all at once. Just started down, and you can't move, walking right out into space. He said, young man, he said, you come back with any more of these forged papers. And he said, you won't need to have to worry about going into service. He said, I admire you for wanting to get into service this bad. But he said, you forged any more papers. And he said, I'll have you put where you won't need to worry about the service. So
He told him one more set of forged papers and you're going to jail.
home, and I went home, and I said, well, I'm in the service. How could you? We didn't sign for you. Well, I said, I forwarded your names. But we can get that road. No, I said, you can't. I'm already sworn in, and I wasn't. But I said, you'd make it a lot easier for me if you would sign these papers in case they ever come back and check them. But if you're not determined to go and get yourself killed, we'll sign them.
Mother wore kind of wore the pants in that family, that type of mother.
It's the most beautiful thing to go up above, get above them clouds and see the sun. Oh, wow. It looks just like a city. That is the most beautiful thing that I have ever seen in my life.
How did you check his oxygen working? How did you check that?
You know, you had a little hangover. You get the hook, and you stuck that in your mouth, and then you turn the valve. And if your head cleared right up, then the oxygen was working. Oh my gosh. The oxygen was working.
I did mention Gene's from Wisconsin, right? Okay, so we're clear.
Otherwise, we called everybody by our first name.
You did, officers too?
Oh, yeah. There was no, we were a family, a tight family.
And that's what made you guys such good friends.
If they didn't live, you didn't live.
Yep.
That is Gene right there, and that is the plane they flew over to Europe. It was a brand new plane. They didn't get to have that one when they got to England, and this was taken in Nebraska right before they flew to Europe. Of the 10 men on that plane, they all died that day, except one other survivor, Jesse. He's got his own story. I could have written a book about him too. So Gene and Jesse were the only two survivors, and there are 3 missing from this picture. And as you can see, Gene's a very entertaining guy, but like I promised you 1 hour, so I got to hold back on my Gene quotes here. So we always, all of these interviews were recorded in my Thursdays with Gene. But one Thursday I told Gene, I said, Gene, you know what? I want to go on a field trip. I want you to take me to the farm that made you who you are. So I took my wife, my 2 boys, and we went to his home farm where that barn is still standing there. That is where he hand-milked cows during the Great Depression. The house where he grew up is still there. Someone's remodeling it right now. As a matter of fact, I was there last spring just to stop by and check the place out, and I noticed some activity going on there. Walked in, introduced myself, and they kind of sighed. So you're the author of Tailspin. Boy, do we have a bone to pick with you. Do you know how many people have stopped by to take pictures and ask those questions about that damn book? And sorry, but get used to it. So, but yeah, I get a lot of people that want to see the farm that raised Gene. And took some pictures with Gene and Carm. We always called her his Blatz angel. He flirted with her constantly, and she always made sure to have Blatz beer at all of our picnics and family get-togethers. And about a week after this picture was taken, my wife and I were also outside doing yard work. And my wife came walking up to me. She said, something's really wrong. I'm like, you look fine. And so she sat down in a chair and she became catatonic, wasn't responding to my questions. My two boys ran up to her and said, Mom, who's the president? Mom, what's her name? She couldn't answer that. And then her left cheek started throbbing violently. And I realized she was having a seizure. So I took her to the local hospital, sedated her, called her oncologist at St. Mary's in Rochester, where she was getting her health care at that point. And over the years, she had this tumor that lodged in her skull, but they always managed to extract it with surgery. So we got to know the neurosurgeon on a first name basis there. And he said, get her butt up here immediately. And we did. And Monday, that was a Sunday. Monday, we had a brain scan, and then we waited for the results that afternoon. And we'd been through this before. This time when the neurosurgeon walked in, he said nothing. He put the scan up on a screen much like this, and he stood in front of it and didn't say a thing. That screen, her brain scan, lit up like a Christmas tree. It was tumors and lines of cancer everywhere. And I was off to the side, just like I am right now. And I looked at him. I said, we really don't need you anymore, do we? And he said, no, you don't. My wife died 6 months. My wife died 6 months later, just before Christmas. And I'm thinking, okay, Gene and I are about a year and a half into the book project at this point. Really not sure if there's going to be a book at this point. My life has changed. I'm a widower with 2 middle school boys, and I'm not too sure about finishing this book. Things will change a year later when I meet my editor, Heather Shoemaker. She is a very successful author in her own right. She's written 4 books, and one of them was a bestseller. And she works as an editor, and she came to the writers' conference that I attended in Madison, and I'm like a deer in headlights there. You know, I'm recently widowed. I have never written a book. I feel very out of place amongst all these other, intellectually gifted and writers. But she sought me out. She had 25 projects she was looking at, and she sought me out and chose mine. Even stayed another night at the conference and wanted to have a meeting with me. And she said, what do you plan to do with this book? I told her my situation, and I said, well, I'm going to write it, just get it down. I'm going to type it up, what I have, get it down on paper, and I'm going to give it to the family. And if they want to self-publish it or just do something for the family, that's fine. And she looked at me and she said, I don't think so. I'm going to stay another night. We're going to talk about this. So she did. We had a meeting. She said, you have to see this through. You need to get an agent. You need to get a publisher. You need to go the traditional publishing route. This needs to be a book. This is an incredible story. She said, I will be your editor. I want you to know if we do it the right way, good books take time. I said, how long? She said, this is going to take you 5 to 10 years if you stick with me. 5 to 10 years. Gene is 88 years old at this point. Now, this is where the story gets a little bit Hollywood. Gene was also visiting the Madison area that weekend, and he had a heart attack. He was visiting friends and family. The family called me on Saturday. I said, can I see him? They said, no, it wasn't looking good that Saturday of that weekend. I called back on Sunday. He's still alive. Can I see him? They granted me permission, even though things weren't looking really great. And UW Hospital was just a few blocks away from my hotel, so I got there quickly, and I remember I was very nervous. And I didn't even wait for the elevator. I remember sprinting upstairs to the floor where his room was. So I'm about to walk down the hallway, got the room number, braced myself. I'm like, okay, what am I going to walk in to see? Is he dead? Is he breathing his last? Does he say his last words to me? Hooked up to machines and monitors blinking. And I walked in and abruptly paused because of this. Can you see that? I walked in and Gene goes, hey, John, get a load of this. That is Miss Wisconsin from that year and Miss Teen Wisconsin. The 2 beauty queens came up to visit the war hero. And I said, we took a picture. And by the way, Gene's son was there, so we can verify this story. And I said, thank you, ladies, but why don't you leave before he has another heart attack? And Gene sat right down on that bed, and I sat in a chair next to Gene's son, Mike. And I said, well, someone wants to make a very big deal of your story, but it's going to take 5 to 10 years. He knew what I was getting at. And he didn't wait long to say, John, if I don't read it down here, I'll read it up there. So we're going to do it. Now, when we're starting to put the book together, I bet, raise your hand if you've heard of this book, Unbroken. Yeah, it's another World War II narrative, another crazy survival story from a bomb recruitment, this one in the Pacific, who also had, like Gene, a terrible POW experience. And the author did a very good job writing that as a story. And I told my editor that I want it to be a narrative. And she said, yes, that's great. We're outlining it. But she said, you know what? She listened to the same quotes that you guys just did with Gene. And she thought him to be a character also. And she goes, he's a funny old man, and I want him in the book too. I'm like, okay, well, she said, do you have Thursdays with Gene? This sounds like the book Tuesdays with Maury. I'm like, okay, all right. And then she said, now in the middle of this, she found out later your wife died of cancer. I said, yes. Jean and Carmen were close. I said, yes. He flirted with her all the time. She was his black angel. She said, well, that has to be part of the story. And at first I said, no. I said, no, I lived it. I'm not writing that. And my answer, she always said, everything is your decision. But she always said, I'll let you think about it, which was her way of saying, I will get my way. And I told her, I said, I've never written one book. Now you have me writing 3. And I don't know if this format's going to work. This is very unusual. And I'm going to get right to the chase here. Now, if you allow me one slide to break you just a little bit, the book's won 2 national awards, and it also won in 2023 the Wisconsin Library Association Book of the Year. That one I'm very proud of. And the reviews have been outstanding. But what's interesting about the reviews for the book, many people say it's not a World War II book. It's more of a relationship book. I remember I was at a bookstore once, and the owner of the bookstore said, you know, we don't know how to shelve this book. Is it a World War II book? This is a relationship book? And I said, yeah. So it is different, and it's been received very well. And based on that, this is my final slide, and then I'm going to end with a video here. A lot of people ask me the questions. They want to get in on those interviews. What was that like? How emotional did you get? How close did you get? And I remember when you got to these guys here, his best friends, these are his friends on the plane. And these were his 2 best friends when he was a POW. And you had to be very careful. But I remember you always used the term brothers. And one time I just said, could you explain it? He said, John, we were closer than brothers. That's all he said. And he often called them his brothers. So based on that, here's how I'm going to end, and then I will take your questions. I'm going to show you a video. My publisher made a promotional video to explore this theme of brotherhood. And for those who've read the book and those who haven't, you're about to meet the characters of Tailspin. Give us just one moment to set it up. And that, everyone, is Tailspin. I thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you very much.